Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Zach's Tech Talk Tuesday podcast. My name is, of course, Ryan McQueeney. I'm the host of this very show. Today, we are talking about the U.S.-China trade war and how or why things have ratcheted up from tariffs to full-blown legal battles involving some of the world's most important and largest technology companies. It's really all happened over the past few weeks where we've seen this shift. We'll talk about a different story that happened a few months ago that may have given us a bit of a hint or a clue at this possibly coming in this direction. But it obviously has been a very dramatic past 7 to 10 days in terms of the U.S.-China trade war. It's been talked about a lot. Of course, I covered it to death last week on the Friday Finish Line podcast, also on my free lunch live web show. So I, probably if you follow my stuff, if you follow Zach's stuff in general, you this may be some repeating information. We got some new news on Monday we're going to go over. So I thought with that new news in mind, we'll take a step back, look at this. This involves, as I said, some huge tech companies. You guys probably have already heard, but we're going to start with last week's developments and kind of work our way to the present. So in terms of this trade war, we thought we made some progress at the G20, which was not this most recent weekend, but the weekend before that. So it was about a week and a half ago at this point. There was a dinner involving Presidents Trump and Xi. There was a 90-day truce made. There was some questions afterwards about whether it was actually made, but essentially what we got out of it was a 90-day halt on new tariffs, which is big because there's supposed to be tariffs that are at 10% right now that are increasing to 25% at the new year. And hypothetically, that should at least be delayed, I think, from my understanding of such a truce. But due to some tweets that President Trump fired off, and some serious legal stuff that went down later in the week, we've taken a turn for what seems to be the worse, as the two global economic powerhouses are now going toe-to-toe in court. So this involves Meng Wanzhou, who is the chief financial officer of Chinese tech behemoth Huawei. It's a tech company, a telecom equipment company. Meng, who is as I said, the CFO, was arrested in Canada at the request of the United States over the weekend that the G20 took place. That's kind of part of it because there were representatives at the meeting from our side of things that knew that this arrest had taken place. And I think when you talk about a truce and you're trying to make progress on the trade war, to be sitting at dinner knowing that this is happening, or maybe even directing it to happen, that conversation probably ends up, the one conversation you have over that dinner that night might end up looking a little bit more insincere, if you will. Now, none of that is to say that there isn't an actual legal case here. So what are we talking about? What kind of charges? Initially, the charges against Meng were unspecified. Earlier reports had suggested that U.S. officials were concerned about Huawei breaking sanctions on Iran. There's also been this thing following Huawei for years and years and years about whether the company would be able to use its networking technology to commit espionage in the United States or elsewhere. As it turns out, it was the Iran thing. Meng is being held responsible for allegedly having used a shell company called Skycom to get around U.S. sanctions on Iran. This would imply that Meng is going to potentially face extradition to the U.S. on these charges, since they are U.S.-based charges. This is complicated by a lot of things, most notably complicated by who Meng is. One of the most important figures in one of the country's most important tech companies, or companies in general, but also Meng is the daughter of Huawei's founder and CEO Ren Zhengfei. I'm not the best at names. I apologize. This huge figure, titan of Chinese business, has long been scrutinized by U.S. intelligence agencies. And the details of this case, when you look at it and when you see what the Canadian prosecutors are arguing, kind of make it seem as if Meng knew that she potentially had some heat coming down on her and maybe altered her behavior because of that, which when you talk about things like bail hearings, these are the types of things that come up. So Canada's prosecutor pointed out that Meng used to travel frequently to the U.S., apparently has a son attending school in Boston, so would visit there somewhat frequently, but then kind of abruptly stopped making trips to the United States in March 2017, which, as I said, kind of implies that she felt the heat a little bit, knew that she was under investigation maybe, and didn't want to travel to the United States. Why did you travel to Canada? Well, she was flying to Mexico. She was apprehended while switching planes, I think, in a layover there. So maybe it wasn't intentional even on that end of things. Well, let's get back to the charges, because I do want to give the prosecutors some credit. I don't want to just say outright this is an escalation of the trade war with no actual justification. It does look like if Canada's prosecutor's case that's coming up here did actually happen, then fraud charges would make sense. So let's remember, it's called Skycom. That's the supposed shell company that the charges relate to. Skycom apparently did business with Iran between 2009 and 2014 when U.S. sanctions were applied. So we're not talking about, from my understanding, we're not talking about this new batch of sanctions we have been discussing this year that everyone's been kind of trying to figure out. This is prior to that. This is sanctions in the past, pre-Iranian nuclear deal that kind of dropped a lot of these sanctions. So what was going on? Well, apparently because U.S. banks had worked with Huawei at this time, Iran's sanctions were violated indirectly because of this shell company and because of the existence of this shell company. Meng's work with Meng and Huawei's work with U.S. companies was technically fraud against those banks. I'm not a lawyer, and I typically try to avoid saying the words "I'm not a lawyer" because but I say them this time to really force home the point that my legal understanding is a little bit limited, and I'm just kind of going off of what the prosecutor is saying here in this particular instance. So I think it would also stand to reason that the details are a little bit limited, just given the high-profile nature of this incident. But as a quick aside, with all that said, I'm not an expert in law. I'm going to go right into what Meng's legal defense was, which is more law jargon. But I just thought that the defense here was interesting. At her bond hearing, Meng's lawyer introduced a PowerPoint presentation from 2013 that Meng had once given to explain to a Hong Kong bank that Huawei had not violated any U.S. sanctions. So almost kind of funny, a old, 5-year-old PowerPoint presentation being used as the legal defense at the bail hearing. The other thing I think to think about in terms of the legal defense that's interesting to me is there's going to be some cultural stuff here that really underscores the difference between U.S. and Chinese culture, specifically as it relates to business practices, because Meng argued that she would not have committed fraud because she would not want to embarrass her father, Huawei, and China itself. So this idea that, I wouldn't have done that crime because I'm in this position and it would embarrass, my family, my company, and my country. To me, that doesn't really seem like something we would hear here in the United States as a defense. But, as I said, it's kind of underscoring the cultural difference that is This idea that you represent all these things in all of your dealings, and it is your responsibility to kind of uphold the integrity of those things. That is something I think that really talks to a important point in Chinese culture. So it's something to think about there as well. But as I discussed at the top of the show, this isn't the only thing that's happened here in this legal situation, in this trade war, and China seeing this escalation, and to me responding in kind this week. And we're going to get into what came out yesterday about Apple and Qualcomm. A Chinese court apparently ordered Apple to stop selling older iPhone models in China after it concluded that Apple infringed on 2 Qualcomm patents. Apple obviously plans to appeal the decision, and the company said all iPhone models would remain available in China for now. And according to the Wall Street Journal's report on the situation, the other development that on that front is that the newest iPhones are safe, according to this specific court ruling. But in my view, this is an escalation of the trade war. As I mentioned, this is kind of the we see your move, we match it with this move. The lawsuit is, however, a part of a larger legal battle between Qualcomm and Apple in China. Really, if you follow Apple or Qualcomm at all, you've heard of this already. These two companies hate each other with a capital H. Maybe capitalize all the letters in that word, because it is an intense back and forth. About what? Well, to me, it's been kind of hard to get a grasp on exactly what they're fighting about. But from Apple's perspective, Qualcomm has been using its market dominance, its monopoly really on certain chips, to unreasonably raise prices. And then Qualcomm says Apple stole its source code and shared it with Intel, which is obviously a key rival for Qualcomm. So it's some IP claims, some patent claims, and some price fixing claims, really. So it's been there's multi-year back and forth, and it's a lot of bickering back and forth, and legal situations here in the U.S. and in China. The latest development, the one that came out this week, according to Reuters, is that the Chinese court has said Apple is violating software patents held by Qualcomm that are specifically related to resizing pictures and managing applications. So this isn't quite that stealing trade secrets and selling it to our rival, but it has to do with, again, resizing pictures, managing applications. That's probably a good thing for Apple that it's something like that, because hypothetically it means Apple could just update its software to circumvent the ruling, to make its applications fit and comply with the court order. Whether or not it intends to do that, or maybe just ratchet this up another level, we don't know yet. Apple did comment yesterday in a press release, I believe, to Reuters on the original story, saying, quote, Qualcomm's effort to ban our products is another desperate move by a company whose illegal practices are under investigation by regulators around the world. In fairness to Apple and their argument there, Qualcomm has been fined millions of dollars for abusing its monopoly in both Taiwan and China. So, maybe Apple is onto something there. Obviously, some personal stuff there between Apple and China and Qualcomm. But I think it would be foolish to think that the Chinese courts themselves would not use their their power to strike back at the U.S. So to me, this is eerily reminiscent of the Micron story that happened over the summer. There was that temporary China ban for Micron that was for about 2 days, all anybody could talk about regarding Micron. We might have even discussed it on this show. Basically, because of a court ruling, Micron was temporarily banned from selling 26 different semiconductor products in China. It was a patent case. Micron rivals United Microelectronics and Fujian Xinyu Integrated Circuit had levied this complaint against Micron. Again, similar situation where it's a patent case. Maybe there actually is some good legal grounding for it. There's obviously it's their own story going on there where it speaks to a rise of domestic competition for chip makers like Micron in China. And so this idea that China wants to build up its own semiconductor manufacturing industry is playing out. Here we have the unique story between Apple and Qualcomm playing out, but it's court decisions that go in the favor of the Chinese companies at times where trade tensions are very tense. And to me, I think we'd be silly to make the connection between those decisions and the timing of those decisions and this trade war. And so I think, we've been levying tariffs back and forth, tit for tat charges on a bunch of different stuff, constantly using the threat of new tariffs in these negotiations. And now we're using what we can on both sides in courts and through the legal process to get even more negotiating power. I think, you could definitely say, hey, this is a little messed up that we've arrested a key business person and intend to use that as a negotiation tactic. I think people could certainly make that argument. It's an argument I would tend to agree with. You would certainly have other people who would just say, all's fair in love and war, and that includes trade wars. So we'll see where this goes next. Obviously, Apple will want to do what it can to get that decision overturned in China, and Huawei will want to do what it can to get its CFO back home and out of the grasp of the Canadian and potentially U.S. justice system. That's going to do it for us today, though. As a reminder, if you feel that I missed something or if you want us to cover a different story, follow up on this story if as it develops, shoot me an email at podcast@zax.com. I'd love to hear from you. Make sure to check out all of our other exclusive audio content at zax.com/podcasts. And please remember to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. We are also available on Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Spotify. As always, thanks for listening to Zach's Tech Talk Tuesday podcast. We'll see you next time.